Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Ken McElrath. I'm the founder and CEO of Skuid, Inc. And I'm going to be talking today about upside down app design and development to drive successful innovation. And the first thing I want to ask is, are you ready to turn app development on its head? And I know that sounds like kind of a silly question, but it's a serious question. And you'll see what I mean as we progress through the slides. So, and to drill into that a little bit further, I'm going to ask you a couple other questions. So have you been involved before in bold and exciting projects that have just fizzled out or failed? And specifically, I'm talking here about app projects or digital transformation projects. And in the process, have you experienced opinions overruling the facts from actual users in the field? Where endless debate or coding of untested solutions has wasted precious time and money instead of testing live prototypes with users. I know I've been involved in stuff like this in the past, and it's been very discouraging. So if you've been in a situation like that, you're in the right place. Some more questions you can ask yourself. Do your users need rewards or punishments to motivate them to use your systems? Do they report to you that it takes too long to actually get to the information that they need? Are they constantly reporting that they're navigating to several different screens or doing infinite scrolling to find the data that's important to them? Do they prefer alternative solutions like email or spreadsheets or even long meetings with a whole lot of people to using your systems? And would they rather do that than log in? Do they need a cheat sheet to use your software? And does it take weeks or months to understand how to use your systems correctly? So if you answered yes to one or many of these questions, you're probably ready for what I'm about to talk to you about. And even further than that, does your company mistrust your data because your users aren't entering the critical information that you need consistently or accurately? Do you regret that only a small portion of the system features that you spent a whole lot of time and money to build actually get used? Are you getting buried in support calls about how to use your systems, or receiving requests for features that you know that you already built, right? They were built years ago, and yet people are asking you to build them. Or are you just getting tired of hearing things like, we just can't seem to get this process right. We always keep making the same mistakes. Why can't this thing just support the process that we want? So again, these are great questions to ask yourself. And I would say if you answered yes to one or more of these questions, you're probably ready for upside down app design and development. Because what we all aspire to accomplish is we want to create effective digital solutions to truly solve some very complex business problems. And specifically in the world of enterprise software, those problems are extraordinarily complex. What our real purpose is to enable people to take advantage of that super complex technology without forcing them to understand how it actually works. At Skuid, we like to say, let's not force people to behave like machines. Let's help people create applications that feel like a natural extension of who they are as a human being. And so in the end, we want applications that from a user's point of view look like this, no matter how complex the system is behind the scenes. It needs to be very, very simple for a user, because that's really what their desire is. But how do we achieve this, right? Well, what I'm here to talk to you about today is what we call a human-centered design methodology. And many of you may have heard of human-centered design before. It's become kind of a buzzword among many technology companies. And what I'm going to talk to you today is about how to make that real. So less theory, more about practical. This is how we walk customers through this process, and hopefully it'll be helpful to you. So first of all, let's talk about what human-centered design is. So there's this ongoing battle, and you're all very familiar with it. It's been going on, for more than 30 years of my career, and the battle seems to be between business and technology. Business is really about getting better, faster, and cheaper solutions, which is really what viability is all about. IT, or the technology side of the house, is constantly wrestling with new technologies old limitations, security, compliance, backlogs, et cetera. So for them, it's all about feasibility. And there's this constant battle, this tension that, by the way, is never going to go away. It's not going to go anyway. It's not going to go away in my lifetime anyway. But the challenge is that if you want to create truly effective digital solutions, it doesn't really start with business and technology. It starts with users, and it starts with something we call desirability. And if you find that you spend a lot of your time in your projects in this battle around what technology stack are we going to use and what's our budget and what's our timing going to be, it may be time to really pull back and take a time out. And that's not a very popular thing to say, but from our experience, it's the right thing to do, because if you want to succeed in creating transformative change, it's mission critical that you begin with the users, fully understanding, taking the time to fully understand what their problems are, their perceived problems, their felt needs, and their real needs, before you even start to think about what technology you're going to use or what budget decisions are going to need to be made. If you start with user desirability, what you can do next is then overlay the business problems and the technical constraints to reveal the best solutions. And the greater the degree of overlap, the better the solutions are going to be. But just a cautionary note here, even if you have 100% overlap between feasibility and viability, between the business requirements and the technology stack, you can still end up with applications that nobody wants to use. And I know that from personal experience. We've seen this happen over and over again. It's very sad, it's very costly, it's very painful. But if you get the users involved right up front and really take advantage of the contributions that they can bring, you can prevent a lot of this pain, maybe even all of this pain. So what does a solution that is desirable to a user look like? Well, we put that into 4 basic boxes. It's utility, efficiency, clarity, and what we call delight. And together, these are what we would call capital D design. Most people, when they think about design, they immediately go to fonts, colors, spacing, and things like that. That's not what we mean by design. We're talking capital D design is starting with utility, efficiency, and clarity. And eventually you'll get to more of the visual appeal pieces. But utility means the user can accomplish their tasks with the application you're building in order to reach their goals. Efficiency is about being able to do their work faster than any available alternative solution. Clarity is really about avoiding training. That's one way to put it. A user can quickly see how the app works, and they can get up and running with it without consulting a manual or getting a bunch of training. And then finally, delight is about the visual appeal of the app. And that visual appeal needs to inspire confidence and in both the tool and in the people who crafted it. If you can do all 4 of those things, you're going to hit it out of the park. But how do we build useful, efficient, clear, and delightful solutions practically and quickly and in our company or in my company? And by the way, that last one we've heard a lot. This human-centered design, that's all nice in theory, but in my company, you don't understand. My company's a real mess and we can't make that work here. Actually, the process that we use has worked in a variety of companies, including our own, which is just as messed up as anybody else's. So you can't use that as an excuse. I'm telling you that right now. And how you do it is with something that, again, has kind of become a buzzword. It's with design thinking. And before you kind of write it off as I've been there, done that. I know this is getting a lot of buzz. What I'm going to talk to you about is how do you actually incorporate it and how do you make it practical in your reality? So design thinking, if you're not familiar with it, is this process of constant divergent thinking and convergent thinking in order to go from the design challenge or the inspiration for your design challenge to the point where you can actually get to a truly innovative solution that is going to really solve the actual problem. So let's make it real. We always start with what everybody starts with. Everybody calls this the discovery process, right? Everybody has one, but for us, it's quite different. For us, it involves uncovering the real problem that a customer or that we are trying to solve. And note that I did not say that we start with the requirements. This is not a discovery of requirements. This is a discovery of a problem. so that we can scope the right requirements based on the real problem. Now, very few customers want to start with a problem definition. They typically think that they already know the solution, let alone the problem. I remember in a previous company, I had a customer, I sat down with him and he says, I want an app that shows what real estate is sold. And I said, okay, so what problem are you trying to solve? Well, the problem is I don't know what real estate is sold. Like, no. Let's step back. And the conversation went on. At the end of the meeting, it became very clear to me that he had a very clear idea in his head of what he wanted, he thought. And I just told him, I will build this for you, but I guarantee you that when this project is built, we're going to throw it away and start over again. I have to be honest with you. And he was very taken aback by that, but he was so confident we went ahead with it. 2 months later, we threw the whole thing in the trash and we started over again because he really wasn't willing to take the time to do that problem, to really understand the problem behind the scenes. So how much discovery you're going to need is really determined by 4 different vectors. Well, 2 vectors, 2 extremes of the vectors. Number one, if you have fully adopted digital tools where everybody's using them 90% of the time, and you've got a super defined and effective process already that you want to just automate, your need for discovery is going to be pretty low. But I will tell you that in most cases where we're brought in, it's the exact opposite, right? There's an analog or highly disconnected digital tools or disparate data. Sometimes it's paper or highly customized spreadsheets, and their process is either broken or not very well defined, or highly variable, which means that the process may be this one day and then the next day it's going to look something different. Or if the economy changes or the business changes, it's going to be moving all over the place. So if you're in that situation, you're going to need a high degree of discovery. I'll just pull back and give you kind of a big picture context here. IDEO, which is a design firm that I've been trained by, they were set out to do kind of an airport security redesign for an airport, and because they've been getting a lot of complaints about the security lines, and they applied this design thinking process and this discovery process to the airport security system. And the way that they do this is the same way that we engage with our customers in discovery. First of all, we start with the facts, just the facts. We don't want you to make any, inferences. We just want to say, what do you see? And so they went out to the airport and they took a bunch of photos of people going through security, and they noticed a lot of patterns, and these 2 images kind of reflect those patterns. And so they asked themselves, what do we see? Well, on the left, you see a sign that says no carts. You see a woman with a baby buggy, not really sure if that's a cart or not. You see a woman dressed in a black jacket pointing to the sign. You see a woman in red standing there looking at her with, kind of a puzzled face, who's got multiple bags. I mean, it's the facts. Just, what are the facts? On the right, you see a woman with a bag on one arm and a child on one arm and a whole bunch of other children with a bottle. And so you just list all the facts. The next step is you say, what can we infer from this? I think you ask things like, how do you think these people are feeling? Is the design working as intended? What isn't working? How would you feel if you were in this particular situation? And you begin to identify with the needs of these people and what they're going through and trying to get through this airport security line. And then step 3 is you start asking yourself, why? Why is this happening this way? And I'm just cutting to the chase of this exercise. Some very interesting perspectives were drawn from this. Number 1 is the process is actually working exactly as designed, meaning that the original problem that the airport thought they were trying to solve was to prevent terrorists from getting onto airplanes. And in that sense, it worked. But they pulled back at the airport and said, oh, wait a minute, is that really what we're trying to do here? Because we're getting all these complaints. And what they realized is that people had an experience of travel, that they wanted it to be happy. They wanted it to be pleasurable. They wanted it to be pain-free. And the lines, the security lines, were actually causing that to be the exact opposite of the case for how people were feeling coming to the airport. They began to dread coming to the airport. And specifically, women with children were having huge issues. And they started digging into why. Is it because they don't know the rules? Well, no, that's not the issue, right? It's because women in particular are thinking about what's going to happen on the other side of security. They found out that women want to be super prepared, not just for their children, but also for their husbands or their spouses on the other side of that security line, and they're willing to bend or break the rules, do whatever it takes to make that happen. And going even deeper, they said, well, why weren't women considered? Well, there were no women on the design committee. There were no mothers on the design committee. And it's a great example of when you don't give solution creators direct access to actual users of whatever you're trying to design, you will make incorrect assumptions that are going to lead to very poor outcomes that you can't diagnose ahead of time. And it's going to be very difficult to change the system on the other side. And then one more note, 95% of applications in our world are designed by men. Let's let that sit with you. And then ask yourself, why do women have trouble using the apps that we design? Right? I just let you sit with that for a while. But as a great example, and I'll get really specific here with another example. This is a case study. We actually worked with a large, a national military organization that was doing asset inspections. Specifically, they were trying to inspect parachutes to make sure that they were packed correctly. Before they came to us, they were using a paper process. You can see an example of one of their booklets down here that describes, or that shows, you know, this is how it was recorded that this parachute was packed, who packed it, when it was packed, et cetera. That process didn't work when they had a painful death because a parachute didn't open. They found the pack, opened it up, found who packed the parachute, and realized that that person had been dishonorably discharged from the organization. They said, oh, wow, what other parachutes did that person pack? Well, paper-based process was never going to show them that. So they tried to digitize the process. So they converted that process into using a CRM system into a data model that was highly complex. It needed to be complex because these parachutes are all over the country in different bases and different deployments all over the world. It's very complex to know where people are and where the parachutes are. Ultimately, they were able to get the process down to 49 clicks in about 8 minutes. Problem was that was a fail because they have so many parachutes they have to inspect. They have to do less. They have to do more than one a minute. And on top of that, the application did not meet their user experience or UI standards. And they didn't want to write a lot of code because this was a highly iterative process that they wanted to be able to make changes to on the fly. And so they said, we're up against it here. So they turned it over to us, and we took them through our design process, and this is what it looked like on the other side. It became a 4-click inspection operation that took about 40 seconds to complete. The design fully met all our UX and UI expectations, and not a single line of code was required. Now, why is that important? It's important because what you're looking at right here is a prototype that is the outcome of a design exercise where we tried to understand what is going to create the most utility, efficiency, and clarity for the user. And yes, there's a little bit of delight in this as well. Obviously, going from what you saw before to this is a more delightful experience. But this is a prototype. It's a working prototype. It's a live application that these people can use. But the next step was to hand it off to actual users in an MVP form and say, is this going to work for you on the devices that you're using? And they wanted to be able to make that next iteration very, very quickly without writing any code. And they wanted to constantly iterate this. Very, very critical to the process that we train them on how to actually do human-centered design. And so drilling in a little bit further to that, if you think about the overall design thinking process, there's also this part of it that can become what we call a design thinking graveyard. And it's actually one of the things that turns people off design thinking when I bring it up, is because they've experienced their own little graveyard. Because part of the process that we take people through is this thing of going from ideation to experimentation. You diverge when you're coming up with your ideas. Once you frame your opportunities and brainstorm those ideas, you have to narrow them down and you have to create experiments. But what typically happens, specifically with digital transformation, is that when you run those, you get to the point where you're ready to experiment, you hand it off to IT, or you hand it off to a systems integrator to write code so that you have something that is actually working that you can experiment with, right? That's a big mistake. because when you start writing code, your budget just it's a budget suck, right? It just goes right out the window. And typically what gets delivered back after you've made that handoff is something that was way too expensive, way too far along, as if it was, the ending solution. And then you're too far along to turn back and you've blown all your budget. So this is why in most organizations who've tried to use design thinking to build applications, when they get to this mode, it becomes, this graveyard of buried hopes when they get to the experimentation phase where things just die. And I've heard this described by large design firms who come to me and said, hey, we're trying to avoid the black hole. And I said, describe the black hole. It's when we have to hand off our prototypes to somebody to code, and then we never see it again, or what we see in the end is just awful. And so you have to try to avoid that. This is where no and low code tools can be extraordinarily helpful, especially if they enable that front end design aspect of things. Another great example of this is another large company wanted to be able to do tracking of employee fitness, and they wanted the users, their employees, to be able to track it themselves. And this used to be a paper-based process. And in this organization, physical fitness is extraordinarily important. And so they said, we need to digitize this. And they talked to us first and they said, no, we don't want to spend all that time in design mode. We know what we need. And so they went off and did it themselves. And they built a PDF version of the paper forms. They tried to roll it out. It failed because it was no less complex than paper and really didn't save them any time. So they said, okay, what we really need is a CRM. And so they tried to move from the paper to a CRM system. That project failed. And it's not that the CRM system was a bad CRM system, it was a great one, but the ability to turn that process into a clickable system took way too many clicks and screens. I showed some of the screens here. There were actually many more than this. So they couldn't achieve the user experience they wanted, which is a very clean, simple process for somebody when they want to, take their measurements or do a workout or whatever. And the other big issue for them was they have very strict branding specifications, very strict UI specifications. They actually had built their own design system, and they said, this looks nothing like us. It's not our application. It looks like the CRM system. And so they came to us and said, okay, we're ready. Let's re-explore it. And we went back and we redefined the problem finally. And in the end, this is the solution that they had. It was everything that the person who was tracking their fitness needed: a dashboard, an assessments questionnaire, scheduling. Everything was on one simple page that they can use on a mobile app or on their laptop or wherever. It was elegant, it was simple, it was super fast, and not a single line of code needed to be created to make this application super adaptable and flexible UI. And then they could roll this out to some early users and then iterate moving from there. And they've iterated it about 4 times since then, still haven't written any code, and it's off and running. So in terms of making it real, that was all about phase 1. I'm sorry, but that was all phase 1 that I just showed you. A little bit of phase 2 in the design and dev column here. And by the way, one point I want to make about this graphic is we show this to customers because we found that clean, linear descriptions of your process are much easier to sell. But the actual process looks like this. So unless you have any false assumptions, it's really messy getting through that first discovery and early design and development stage before you can get to a pilot, which is why we use a low-code user experience platform to do all of this, because it's a great platform for enabling the messiness of those first 2 processes. We can actually use this platform to do our prototypes, to do our wireframing, to do our early design system, and then roll it directly from that into a working application. So we call it design to app instead of design to code. So we go directly from design to app, and they can actually work with a working application to test this. One more case study here. We had a multinational hospitality organization that was trying to build RFPs, and they wanted to do it very, very quickly. And it was taking them days. And they kind of went down the same path. They said, well, what we need to do is get all this data into a CRM system. And what they ended up with was 16 different screens. It was taking them more than 10 minutes to create a very, very simple RFP. And what they had didn't match their branding standards again. And they said, look, it needs to look like our hotel chain. This is a non-starter. And then the other side of the prototyping exercise and the early design prototyping exercise, they ended up with a single 4-step wizard. Took less than 50 clicks and less than half the time it did on the previous process to get it. And this was just the first phase. We can get even better than that because we're going to continue to iterate. And I keep mentioning this iteration thing. It's because it's extremely important. Iteration is a must. And back in the 90s, we called this continuous improvement, right? And I for those of you who remember Deming and his continuous improvement process, I think Deming is going to have a huge resurgence in the 2020s. Because look, if all work is a process and all apps are in essence automating processes, then you need a platform that can execute continuous improvement. Because if you don't do continuous improvement, user adoption is going to fall off or crash and burn, and your apps are going to become dinosaurs. And so again, I'm very, very thankful that there's this new generation of no-code platforms that can actually support agile continuous improvement processes so that you can build and iterate your applications. So the final phase of our process is phase 3, and that's the coaching phase. So typically in phase 1 and phase 2, we're working side by side with our customers to help them understand what design thinking is, to understand how that relates to human-centered design. We're working side by side with them and coaching them on how to own it, so that when we get through with the first process, the next iterations and the next applications that they build to drive that continuous improvement, they can do themselves. So essentially, we're teaching them to get through this craziness so that they can launch into their next phase of craziness and doing human-centered design all the way through it. And remember, along this path, this is why it's so important to write little to no code, because if the less code you write, the easier it's going to be to iterate and make changes on the fly so you can remain truly agile from start to finish. So just as a quick review here, what it takes to be successful with human-centered design. Number 1 is you have to involve a very diverse cross-functional team, because a shared cross-functional understanding of the problem in all its complexity is the only thing that's going to reveal solutions that will minimize unintended negative consequences. You need to avoid handoffs, because while handoffs may give the illusion of efficiency, you need to minimize them all the way through this human-centered process. Otherwise, you're going to get somebody else's interpretation of your prototype or how you think you should solve the problem versus what you know, taking everything that you know. And speaking of what you know, you need to adopt a learning mindset. You need to be able to test your riskiest assumptions in the cheapest, fastest way possible, which means you'll spend less time and money on poor solutions and find the best solutions faster. And then you also need to iterate on the feedback that you get, which means end users need to be involved throughout the process. So you can do that rapid iteration based on actual feedback from the field in order to improve adoption on the back end. On the benefit side, you're going to create greater clarity and alignment, because as your team members and stakeholders gain a truly clear purpose and direction, it's going to result in high energy and motivation on your team. You're going to be able to drive greater ROI and fantastic adoption. I mean, literally, we've seen adoption go from less than 50% of previous systems to adoption in the high 90s and maintained by following this process. And one of the biggest benefits is you're going to fully leverage all the strengths of the people in your constituency, meaning that you're going to be able to get all that shared knowledge, their shared experience and skills of not just end users, but also your business stakeholders, your designers, and your developers. When all that comes together around a transformation project, it's going to be successful. And then you're also going to be able to stay agile, which means you can adapt easily to problem complexity, as well as organizational changes, market shifts, different cultures, and yes, even pandemics. You're going to love human-centered design if you want truly productive meetings and aligned teams, you value end users and their opinions, and you really desire joyful adoption of the apps you create, right? But you're going to resist it if you fear that it's a front for inflating consulting hours. Yes, I've actually had people say that, but it's truly not. It's actually going to reduce the number of hours you spend building applications if you go through this process up front. You're going to resist it also if you've had bad experiences in the past with drawn out research projects that didn't appear to have any impact. Typically, that lack of impact was because it died in that graveyard of prototyping where it was handed off to somebody else. You're going to resist it too if you are facing really huge pressures right now, where the risks of slowing down to go through this human-centered process feel greater than the risks of making really bad, wrong assumptions, right? So got to be careful of that one. And you're also going to resist it if you think that visual design or design thinking, if when you hear those terms, you immediately go to design, right? You know, somebody who's wearing dark glasses and is only wearing a black t-shirt like me. But and so you need to kind of get yourself out of that old design paradigm and into what does design really mean, and it's about this whole process. A couple of other things are going to be challenging if you're in an organization that practices the following, right? So if you think this is really just a software purchasing decision rather than a partnership to create effective solutions, there's going to be a lot of resistance in your organization. If you don't have a budget to actually achieve your desired outcomes, that's going to be a problem. And probably the most important one is if your organization is the kind that just wants to blame users for failing to adopt software, human-centered design is probably not going to be a big win for you. But my assumption is that that's changing very rapidly and that everybody wants the users to have software that they actually want to use. Because in the end, if you want effective applications, you have to start with user desirability. And at Skuid, we call this the freedom to thrive in the digital enterprise. And we call it humanizing enterprise software, because that's really what it's all about. And what we mean by freedom and humanization is that you're going to get full adoption instead of abandonment of your applications, super fast innovation instead of falling behind, and frequent iteration instead of stagnation. So thank you. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today. And let's humanize the enterprise software together. Thank you.